I'm Roger Baker, Executive Director of the Stratfor Center for Applied Geopolitics at RANE, a global center of excellence for geopolitical intelligence and analysis. Learn how you can put geopolitics to work for your organization at ranenetwork.com.
Hello and welcome to RANE's Essential Geopolitics podcast. Political instability is on the rise in Africa, driven by a new wave of youth activism. Gen Z is increasingly vocal in demanding political and economic reforms, as seen in Morocco and Madagascar. In Morocco, the Gen Z 212 protests began in late September, criticizing the government's public service provision, corruption in the government, and the current prime minister. RANE's Middle East and North Africa analyst, Kristin Ronzi, is here on the podcast to help analyze the growing trend of Gen Z protests and unpack the likely implications. Hi, Kristin. How are you?
Hi. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for coming on. So, what were kind of the primary events and factors that led to the recent protests in Morocco?
Absolutely. So, in late September, we saw some initial protests begin due to the deaths of 8 women in childbirth and experiencing pregnancy complications at public hospitals. And this was something that kind of galvanized a lot of grievances that had already pre-existed. For one, we have economic situations in Morocco that are very unfavorable to young individuals. And then we also see this growing healthcare crisis that is fueled by brain drain in Morocco, where there are insufficient healthcare providers for Moroccan citizens. This is even more so in rural areas that are hard to service. So we see these inequalities, and many of the young Moroccans are looking at these and looking at the promises from the government and not seeing them fulfilled. This also comes amidst a backdrop of Morocco spending significant amounts of money on these mega projects ahead of hosting the World Cup in 2030 along with other countries. And so there's sort of this sort of paradox that a lot of Moroccans are seeing, that their basic needs are not being fulfilled, but at the same time the government has the means to fund these large projects. One of the other things that we've seen is a general discontent with the current government that's led by Prime Minister Aziz Akhannouch. He is a billionaire, and so his perspective is not necessarily that reflective of most Moroccan citizens. So there's a general disconnect that many Moroccans feel with their current government. So all this to be said, the protests have capitalized on a lot of these broad grievances and garnered support from a lot of youth in Morocco. One of the challenges, though, that we're seeing with these protests is that a lot of them are organized through social media, such as Discord, especially in Morocco, has been prevalent, but also Instagram and other social media sites. And because of this, you don't really have a centralized leadership. And so that has empowered a lot of Moroccans because of the connectivity of these protest organizations, but it's also led to a variety of demands that are not necessarily centralized. So many of the initial demands were for increased expenditure on healthcare and education, meeting some of those public service needs, but they've grown over time as well to include the resignation or dismissal of the prime minister. So you have a wide array of demands, and some of them, as we'll discuss in the upcoming minutes, have been met and addressed, and others have not. One of the other challenges is that even though this has gained support among younger Moroccans, it's hard to galvanize broader support among some of the older generations. One of the reasons for this is the violent clashes that we've seen at some of these protests between young individuals, including minors, and police. We've also seen instances of vandalism as well. And so that's isolated some of the individuals who may be sympathetic to some of these grievances, but don't condone the violence. We've also seen some of that rhetoric echoed by some of the political parties as well in Morocco.
So how exactly has the government been responding to these protests?
It's kind of a mixed bag. We have seen a couple of deaths during these clashes, and that's gained a lot of criticism for the government's handling of these protests. We saw protests resume ahead of the king's address to the Moroccan parliament, and this was an opportunity for him to kind of acknowledge the protesters' grievances, acknowledges the ongoing social inequities as well in Morocco. And he did so. And so one of the things we saw after that speech, even though protests resumed the next day, was a revision to the Moroccan budget. So we see increased spending, especially to the healthcare and education sector. It's increased by about $15 billion for the upcoming fiscal year, and this is about 10% of Morocco's GDP. One of the challenges, though, is that this is kind of a band-aid measure for broader structural inequities that won't be resolved in 1 year. So this brings up the question of how long-term Morocco can sustain this. In the short term, though, that's going to appease a lot of the protesters who have called for increased social expenditure. The other thing that we've seen is additional budget allocations to address regional inequalities between the urban areas and the rural areas. Again, this is not something that's going to be fixed in 1 or even a couple of years. So that's one of the challenges that this current government faces. We've also seen them take steps to improve the women's and youth participation in the government, and we've seen them take steps through adopting draft laws to prohibit convicted criminals from running for office, because corruption within political parties as well as corrupt individuals was another one of the main grievances that we've seen arise in these protests. However, we have not seen a major push for the resignation or dismissal of the prime minister that is gaining a lot of momentum. There was an appeal by the leaders of this group to the king to dismiss the prime minister, but we haven't really seen that shift change quite yet, and Akhnouch has resisted previous calls for his resignation, so it's likely that he's going to maintain this path. And at this current stage, the dynamic is really offsetting any sort of criticism from the monarchy to this prime minister. So until we start to see a lot of pressure against the king, and criticism that could potentially threaten the monarchy, the king is actually well positioned to allow the prime minister to take the heat for some of these unfavorable policies. So that's one of the reasons that we haven't really seen this change yet with the government. We're likely to see over the next several months some change in personnel among the cabinet ministers. This is something that Akhnouch has done previously when there have been unfavorable policies, and he's tried to change up the personalities. That doesn't mean the policies are going to shift that significantly, but it does imply that there are new personalities with new ideas who could maybe change some of these problems within Morocco.
When or how long do you think it will take for the protests to die down? And if so, will it be as a result of concessions being made to their demands, or do you think there's a natural kind of course to be run in general with protests?
We've already seen the protests weaken from the initial stages. There are a couple of reasons for this. One of the challenges that this protest movement faces is that there's not really centralized leadership. So this is something that's become very challenging because you have these organizations through Discord, through other social media, but there's no face to the protest movement, and there's no clear direction. We've seen this as well with the expanded demands from initially, public service provision increases and anti-corruption to a change in the government. So that's one of the challenges that they're facing. The other thing is you have a division between some of the protesters, and this is just a few, this is not the majority, but that are more inclined to take violent actions, and the protest movement more broadly, which is called for nonviolent protests. So this is another schism that we're expecting to see further divide. That being said, a lot of these grievances are likely going to persist, even though the concessions have been made, and obviously the outcomes of these concessions are still to be seen. The broad structural inequalities are not going to be resolved anytime soon. And so when you see these sort of instances like the patient's deaths in the hospital, like few viable or beneficial job opportunities after graduation, when you see high unemployment rates for women, college graduates, young people in Morocco, these are going to remain very salient issues. And this is something that we're going to see probably in the 2026 parliamentary elections as well, become very pertinent for these Moroccan political parties to try and propose, new changes, new policies, something like that. But the broader issue is that we've seen other governments try to address these problems and fail. And so we've seen in the 2017-2018 protests, some of these grievances arise. Morocco has kind of addressed them. The protest movement has died down, but the grievances still remain. And this is something that we're expecting to see with this particular protest movement as well.
We've seen an uptick of Gen Z protests, especially in the Middle East. Is there a reason that certain countries or areas in the Middle East are so susceptible to Gen Z protests?
There are a couple of reasons, broadly speaking, in the region that these protests are more likely to occur or have the potential to occur. So for one, you have the Arab Spring, which had a lot of the grievances represented during that time. And since that time period, we haven't seen enough change to address these grievances. You also have a youth bulge in many Middle Eastern and North African countries who are looking at their governments and seeing that there are insufficient public service provisions, there are not a ton of job opportunities that they're looking for. And so you see these societal issues and a young population that has access to social media and is able to organize. One of the challenges, though, that we're going to see with sort of these Gen Z protests and protest movements in general in the Middle East is the inability to sustain them. We've seen protests in Turkey earlier this year. We've seen protests in Morocco now with the Gen Z protests. We've also seen some protests in southern Tunisia. But these protest movements do not necessarily have the ability to sustain themselves, especially when they are facing government opposition. So this is one of the challenges that we're seeing with longer-lived protest movements. But that being said, you have a lot of these countries facing similar grievances, and you're also seeing successful protest movements throughout the world. If we look at Nepal, for example, if we look at Madagascar. So that is emboldening a lot of people, especially young people, to demand better public service provision, better opportunities. It's just a question of how this is able to unfold, and some of them will likely try to emulate these other movements, but they will face individual challenges within the countries themselves.
You kind of started to answer this question, but I guess what do you think the likelihood or outlook is for a future Arab Spring kind of 2.0, where there are widespread protests and unrest and insurgency across multiple nations?
This is something that many Middle Eastern countries are looking at these protest movements and are getting concerned. There are a couple of reasons why these protest movements are not likely to be as sustained, but they do have the potential. So for one, we have a lot of countries who looked at the Arab Spring protest movements and learned from them. So we're seeing countries kind of proactively crack down in some cases against protest movements that have the potential to expand more broadly. The other thing is you also have these Gulf Arab states who are looking at these potential hot zones like Morocco, where other protests could also come about, and they're probably getting very concerned. So one of the things that's a little bit specific to Morocco's case is that it's also a monarchy. And so even though we've seen Gulf Arab states move away from just bailing countries out and usually focus more on targeted investments in the country, Morocco still has that kind of monarch connection with a lot of these Gulf Arab states, that if the protest movement were to swell and expand, they would try to lean on these connections. Likely, we're going to see this unfold in Morocco with the question of spending and how it can sustain this degree of spending long term. In Morocco's case, they're already facing economic issues, and so spending 10% of their GDP on healthcare and education is probably something that's not going to be sustainable in a long term. However, looking at this protest movement, they may try to reach out to Gulf Arab countries to support this funding to prevent these protest movements and to more structurally address these grievances. So that's one of the things that is important to consider about these specific protests. Gulf Arab states are going to be specifically concerned about the potential for monarchies such as Jordan, such as Morocco, to face government changes, because that could potentially lead to a contagion effect, that if Morocco's monarchy goes away, potentially that could inspire that of the Gulf Arab countries, and obviously that's something that they're very concerned about. That being said, we're several steps away from that, but that is something that's going to be in the back of these leaders' minds when they consider the effects of broader protest movements. In terms of an Arab Spring type effect, many countries, especially in North Africa, are facing similar challenges. And so if we do see a broader, more sustained protest campaign, that's going to likely increase the concern that other countries could look to that successful protest movement and face similar challenges. But as we've seen from the Morocco protests, they did inspire similar protests in Algeria with this Gen Z 213 protests. But they were not they didn't gain momentum in Algeria. This was something where they tried to emulate the Morocco model and have social media discourse, and it was not very successful. So even though we're seeing small bits of other countries maybe trying to look at Morocco's example, or even other examples throughout the world of protests, youth-led protest movements, but even protest movements in general, there are still a lot of constraints.
Well, thanks so much, Kristin. I look forward to hearing more from you on this as it continues to evolve. You can read more of Kristin's analyses on this topic and others on our Risk Intelligence platform. You can also sign up to receive our complimentary Risk News and Analysis Digest Risk Book. Simply register on our website, ranenetwork.com, to receive this intel directly to your inbox every weekday morning. We've also included the link to subscribe in the description of this episode. As always, thanks for joining us.